Hey there, class. History students. It is April 14th, and we are coming at you from social distancing with our next lesson about Canadian history. Although today, it's not going to be so much about history, because we're going to be talking about Canadian identity. So, during this course, we've talked a lot about Canadian history, right? We've talked about the Aboriginal people, we've talked about how the country was settled. We talked about our first Prime Minister, John A. Macdonald. We talked about World War One. We've talked about World War Two. We've talked about what's been happening in Canada since World War Two. So we've talked about a lot of different things in this course. But today we want to talk about Canadian identity and Canadian culture. So for most countries, the question of, well, what's your identity or what's your culture is pretty straightforward. But for Canada, because of our unique situation, Canadians are often asked, well, what is Canadian culture, and is there one at all? So, what do I mean by that? Well, let's start with a question that is often asked by Canadians, which is, are Canadians different from our neighbors, Americans? The Americans down south, they're very big, they're very loud, and compared to them, we're a very small country compared to them. And we have a lot in common. We can go down the list. Generally speaking, Canadians watch the same kind of movies and television shows as Americans. We read the same kind of books, we wear the same clothes, and of course, we drive the same cars. We talked about that last week when we were talking about the economy, right? We eat the same kind of food, and we also, except for the Quebecois, of course, who speak French, we also all speak the same language. And just like the Americans, Canada is a Christian majority nation, right? And so we share some of the same holidays and everything like that as well. So we have a lot in common with the Americans here in this country, right? A lot of overlap, you could say. The Americans are very big. They're very, like I said, they're very loud. And we are about 10% of their population. And our culture overlaps with American culture a lot more than any other English-speaking nation, right? Britain, for instance, is very, very different, culturally speaking, than America. Same with Australia or New Zealand or any other English-speaking nation, right? They usually don't have much trouble saying, well, this is how we're different from the Americans. But because Canada, just geographically, is so close to America, well, often we have some trouble answering this question of, well, what makes Canadian identity, and more importantly, how are we different from the Americans? And let's talk a little bit about some of the reasons why people have that kind of trouble. Now, there's a lot that's unique about Canada. Like, what about Canadian food? That's a very good question. Well, let's talk about that, Uranos, right? So, when you think about culture, a lot of people, the first thing they think about is food. And, you know, it's a legitimate thing. Most countries around the world have their own special Canadian food. Or cultural food, I should say. But, well, what is Canadian food? Let's take a look. Well, if I do a Google search and I say the top 5 or top 10 Canadian dishes, usually you get this at the top of the list, right? Poutine. Now, poutine is a snack, right? It's essentially some French fries with gravy on top, along with some cheese curds, right? And that is the number one answer, I can tell you, when it comes to what is Canadian food, right? It's usually poutine at the top, and as you go down the list, you hear about other things. You got, for instance, bacon, right? Which is essentially just bacon. Then you've got, I don't know what a Caesar is here, right? This is a list I found online, by the way, right? A Caesar, which is some kind of cocktail. right? And there's also these things, the beaver tails. Anyone ever had a beaver tail? Right? You can usually... There's one place to buy them in Toronto, which is downtown, right? So beaver tails is another thing people name as their Canadian food, right? And there's also... Well, that's a pizza, right? You know, that's not... That's just a pizza. Then there's butter tarts, right? These things, anyone ever had those? So, the point I'm trying to make is that when it comes to the food category, if you're talking about Canadian food, right, there's not actually a whole lot of things to be very proud of, right? You know, compare it to something like if I were to say, okay, let's go get some Lebanese food, or let's go get some Chinese food, or let's go get some Japanese food, right? There's a whole bunch of things that you would think of, like, oh, okay, we're going to have sushi if we're going to Japan, or we're going to have ramen, or we're going to have udon, right? So there's all these food that you would be getting if you're going for Japanese food, right? But when it comes to Canadian food, well, what do you guys think? Can you guys think of a Canadian food? Is there a food that I'm not mentioning that's this Canadian food? In terms of our food culture, well, it's a little weak, isn't it? Yeah, but what about special Canadian traditions and holidays? Well, we have all of the religious holidays, right? We just had Easter, right? We also have Christmas, right? And everything like that. So we all have all of the religious holidays that most of the Christian world has, and of course the Americans have too. We of course also celebrate Halloween here, right, which is also, by the way, an American invention, right? But in terms of Canadian holidays, well, I've lived here all my life and I can only really think of two, right? There's Canada Day, which is July 1st, which is when our country was first created. And then there's the one coming up in May, Victoria Day, which is also called Fireworks Day, which is a celebration for Queen Victoria, right? That might strike you as a bit weird because, number one, Queen Victoria is not the current queen, right? Queen Victoria was the queen in the 19th century, right? But we still have a celebration for her because it's tradition. Right? So, in terms of uniquely Canadian traditions, well, there aren't actually, at least in terms of holidays, a whole lot, right? You know, you can, if you guys can think of some Canadian traditions, well, tell me what they are, right? Because I can't, you know, having lived here my whole life, right, in terms of traditions and customs, right, we don't really have that many in the country that are unique to us, right? We have a lot that the Americans do too, but in terms of unique Canadian traditions, there's not too much of that. Now, but what about music? Well, most cultures do have a unique type of music, and in terms of Canada, there are actually quite a lot of internationally famous musicians that are from Canada. Right? Justin Bieber, for instance, who is a name that is unfortunately known all around the world, is Canadian. Drake is Canadian. Celine Dion is Canadian. Avril Lavigne is Canadian. Bryan Adams is Canadian. Alanis Morissette is Canadian, right? There are lots and lots of examples of musicians who are known all around the world who were born in Canada. So, in terms of music, Canadians certainly have a lot of famous Canadian artists. But, well, I don't know. Should we call that Canadian music, right? So should we say that Justin Bieber or Celine Dion or Avril Lavigne, that's Canadian music? Is that how we should think about it? Because when I speak to people from outside of the country, they're usually kind of surprised to learn that, oh, those people are from Canada, right? So, I don't know. Should we consider that to be part of our Canadian culture? Or are they just people that just happen to be born here and they're artists? I don't know. That's sort of one of the interesting questions when it comes to Canadian identity. Now, but what about hockey? Ah, that's true. There's also hockey. That's a big part of the Canadian identity also, right? We do have hockey as our national sport, right? And hockey is by far the most popular sport in Canada. But there are some weird numbers about that too, right? Right now, there are only 7 Canadian hockey teams in the NHL, and 24 of those teams are 24 of the other teams are American teams, right? So most teams in hockey are American, right? They're not Canadian teams. And in fact, many Canadian players end up going to the United States on those teams in order to, well, make the most money and to play, right? And the last time a Canadian team won a Stanley Cup, right, was way back in 1993, right, when the Montreal Canadiens won the Stanley Cup. So it's been, what is that, over 25 years since Canada won the Stanley Cup, right, and we were the champions of hockey, right? So, you might often hear, hockey's Canada's game, but is it Canada's game? Uruno seems to be a bit uncomfortable with this idea. Okay, you can go. You've been good. So, hockey itself, right, it's made in Canada, and it is loved by Canadians, right, but the sport itself is dominated by the Americans, right? Again, we haven't won, much to the chagrin of, Toronto Maple Leaf fans especially. We have not actually won a Stanley Cup in more than 25 years in this country, right? And based on what my hockey friends have said, some of you might know Mr. Hicks at the school, I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. So we're not good at hockey either, even though we love it. So, Canada, as a country, is a country that often is in the middle of a weird sort of identity crisis, right? People in Canada are often asking this question about what makes Canadians into Canadians and what makes us different from the Americans, right? A thing you'll often hear people say about this particular subject is that Canadians are nice and Canadians are polite, right? So that's sort of one of the first things people say about Canada when it comes to this kind of question, that, compared to the Americans, we're nice and we're polite. But, well, the question I've always had is, well, what does that really mean for us, right? You look at us compared to other countries, right? If you were to ask, what is a French person like, or what is a German person like, right? There's a lot more that they would say than just nice and polite, right? But, for Canadians, that's often the first thing they'll say about themselves, is that we're nice and that we're, well, polite, right? We're polite people compared to the Americans, right? So, some people, not me, by the way, I think Canadians are very different than Americans for reasons I'll talk about, but some people do say that essentially Canadians are mini Americans, right? So that we are just, an extension of America, right? Just sort of another version of them, right? That is maybe a little nicer, but essentially the same thing, right? Because we essentially do all the same things that America does. So, today, what I'd like to do is ask you guys that question, right? Each of you have lived here for some amount of time. Some of you have lived here your entire life. Some of you have lived here just for a couple of months, right? And, you each have different experiences of this country. But I want you guys to think about this question for today, which is, what do you guys think makes Canadians different from Americans, right? If you were to tell someone who, doesn't really know much about Canada, and they asked, well, hang on, aren't you guys the same as America, right? What would you say, right? What makes the Canadians very, very different from them, right? So, This question is important because it's going to be building to our CPT, which is coming up in 2 weeks, right? The final presentation. So that's why it's an important question, right? And let's add another question in here. How do I put this? What are the things that are important for Canada's culture? Right, so if we're going to talk about culture here, well, what are the things that you think are important for us, right? If someone were to ask you, well, what is Canadian culture, right? Or, what's important in your culture? Do you have a special food? Do you have a special custom, tradition, or something like that, right? What is it you would say? All right, so, that's what I would like you to know for today. So, as always, you should email me at faisal.ahmed@tdsb.on.ca, right? That's my email address. And so I'd like you to just toss me an email there with your answers, and we'll do a questions and answers video on this tonight. So what I'll do tomorrow, by the way, is I'm going to give you a reflection assignment. It's going to have 6 questions, and you'll pick 3, right? So you'll be answering these 3 questions. This is a replacement for the test you were going to do, right? Remember there was going to be a World War II test once upon a time before March break? Well, that's gone out the window. I don't know what to do with that. So instead we're going to be doing this reflection assignment tomorrow, right? And what I'm going to do is you'll have until Monday to answer these questions, right? So that's the plan for now, right? So essentially tomorrow I'll give you 6 questions and you'll pick 3, and they're going to be all about Canadian culture. Oh, and each one will be answered in basically a short paragraph, right? So that's sort of my solution to the fact that I can't give you a test, is I'm going to give you this reflection, right? So we'll talk more about that tomorrow. But for now, for today, what I want to do is just talk about Canadian culture. So please send me your answers, and let's talk about what you think. Well, what makes Canadians different from Americans, right? If anything. By the way, if you want to say nothing, that's okay. That's your point of view, right? I don't argue with people's point of view. I just want to make sure they back them up. Anyway, guys, so that's the plan for today. And please send me those emails. I want to have a nice Q&A tonight. All right, so take care. I hope you all had a good Easter, and I hope you're all safe and healthy.